All right, very good. I'm going to ask our speakers to come up here to the front table first, and I'm going to make a few comments about my reactions to the various talks and presentations, some ideas that we might want to talk about further. I also have asked our contributors to bring up any comments they might have, and we very much welcome a conversation that involves all of you as well. Because we hope for the next 45 minutes or so, the rest of this roundtable discussion will be just that. It will be a discussion that will involve as many of our participants as possible. So I wanted to just mention a few issues that occurred to me as we were going through the various presentations today, as some food for thought, and some of these involve some questions to the speakers. But to help target our conversation on some of the themes that I think are of particular importance when it comes to dealing with questions of controversies and recent discoveries in Asian archaeology, and how controversies and recent discoveries really impact the contemporary world, the world we live in, and the significance and importance of archaeology as a practice, as a science, as a discipline within our society. And so these thoughts are not in any particular order. They're more or less in the order that they occurred to me as the talks came up. But I think that some of them cross-cut a number of the different presentations. One of which has to do with archaeological practice and publication practice. This was highlighted at the very end by Professor Jia in her comments on the way in which the discipline of Chinese archaeology, which I'm most familiar with of the various perspectives that were presented today, has targeted certain questions as being of particular importance and interest within the discipline as a whole. And I think the points that she made are very important concerning the relationship between practitioners of Chinese archaeology, for example, within China, who are based within institutional contexts that exist within the People's Republic of China, and those who are elsewhere, whether they be based in North America, like myself, or in Korea, like Professor Parth, who also works extensively in China, or in Taiwan, or elsewhere. One issue which was pointed out is the degree to which the emphasis in Chinese archaeology related to, for example, the origins of Chinese civilization within the discipline within China focuses on certain topics, whereas it may be constructed as being more theoretical in North America. I don't frankly think that's true when it comes down to it, because there's an equal fundamental degree of theory that is essential to any conceptualization of what civilization means and what it means to rely on certain pieces of evidence to support the understanding of civilization's development or not. But the way in which it's packaged, the way in which the questions are asked, for example, are different in different contexts. And I find that it sometimes can be easier to ignore an entire body of scholarship if it's dismissed as being either overly theoretical or underly theorized, and that works in multiple directions. So, for example, there has been in North American scholarship on Chinese archaeology a tendency, at least in the past, and I think this carries to the present day to some extent, to dismiss Chinese archaeology as being non-theoretical because it's all more or less data presentation. This is true towards Japanese, an attitude towards Japanese archaeology, perhaps even more severely within the North American Academy. And to some extent, that's an excuse to dismiss a body of scholarship, with the exception of perhaps pieces of data that can be mined. And I think that speaks very acutely to the nature of a disciplinary organization. So I would be interested in hearing how that relates to, for example, in archaeological practice in Cambodia and in India, but also to general thoughts about those issues. Another topic that came up today in a number of talks had to do with, to some extent, the development of theoretical underpinnings within the discipline, and particularly the reliance on Marxism, whether it has to do with child's importance in archaeology everywhere in the world, whether it be India, as we heard from Professor Lahiri, or Japan, or China, very certainly, and how that that tension in terms of the significance of Marxism as a theoretical orientation and as a source of inspiration, and then the position of Marxism as a political construct in the contemporary world have come into conflict with one another. I mean, to some extent, maybe all archaeologists have some degree of Marxist perspective because of our reliance on the materialism of the ancient world, the significance of technology in terms of understanding it, the directions in which a Marxist perspective often emphasizes and points at ourselves. And yet, of course, the associations with Marxism have other implications and that make an explicit reference to Marxist perspectives either beneficial in many contexts, particularly historically in certain of the contexts we've heard about, or not acceptable in other contexts, and particularly in North American archaeology for periods of time, although increasingly less so. I was recently on a dissertation defense of one of our students who has a very explicitly Marxist perspective on the role of pigs in the ancient world. It's Max here. So a topic I think that deserves some more discussion in terms of the way in which controversies emerge within the discipline of archaeology in Asia. Another topic I think that is worth commentary has to do with nationalism and nationalist politics. Perhaps Ken talked about this most explicitly in his comments on the oldness of the Chauhan, which of course now they're not the oldest ceramics in the world anymore, so what does that do to the right-wing politicians in Japan? For those of you who don't know, there's much older ceramics that have been documented in China now. I doubt that the same politicians would then cede, okay, the Chinese are more superior to us now because that was our line of evidence. So I wonder how these things get reframed based on the most recent archaeological discoveries. We heard a little bit about the way in which in Cambodia, and I'd like to hear a bit more about this, the connections between earlier manifestations of archaeological similarity in later periods are brought into a discourse on the connections with the past and the present. But we, in that context, avoided a little bit about the borderlands explicitly. And in fact, it's one of the very interesting places in which archaeological data are often brought to bear on contemporary political issues. So, for example, what's going on the borders with archaeology in terms of contemporary discourse on the borders between Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos and Thailand. We know a little bit about what's going on in the borders between, in the islands between Japan and the mainland. We can anticipate similar things in other parts of areas surrounding every country in East Asia, and this happens all around the world as well, of course. And so the question of how archaeology is brought into nationalist politics is one that's certainly relevant to our conversations, and it relates to another topic which we see come out in different ways in some of the talks today, and that has to do with indigenous archaeology. Perhaps the way, as Liz pointed out at lunch, that the political aspects of archaeological interpretation are most explicitly observed within a North American context, although there are many other ways as well, but in the context of the relationship between Native American peoples and their ownership over their past. This was first brought to our attention by Professor Chauhan, who mentioned the way in which new genetic information, archaeological data of various sorts are brought into a discussion of the position of the, I'm sorry, I forgot the term that's being used in South Asia, tribals in South Asia. The indigenous populations in various places are very much constructed in their contemporary position within society in relation to the material record of their past and the way in which that material record can be connected to the present. Ken mentioned the case of the Ainu, which is an example of this. We recently had a visit by a delegation of Ainu archaeologists to the Peabody Museum, who are very interested in coming up with, or in having some help with the process by which the legal framework for repatriating human remains from Ainu individuals that are now housed in certain museum contexts and in private collections might be managed within the context of Hokkaido, for example. The way in which the most recent genetic information on the connections between other Homo that contributed to the genetic makeup of non-African populations such as the Denisovans to certain populations in Southeast Asia like the Melanesians. There was just a paper recently that shows that there are certain populations that that have contributions from species that were, or subspecies that were not contributors genetically to every modern human. How that is then worked into the contemporary discourse on the relationship between different populations within national contexts is going to be very interesting, I think, as ancient DNA is increasingly used to help us understand the diversity of the human makeup around the world. I can go on, but I'm not going to go on forever. I do want to mention a couple more things. I mean, one has to do with a talk, or the comment that, or an example that Professor Pak mentioned concerning Legoland, which is one of the examples that perhaps gave me most internal tension, given how much I like Legoland, and my son likes Legoland, and yet the very real question, very important question that is raised by that example of preservation versus development. What are the decisions that need to be made in terms of helping us understand where priorities lie in contemporary society for deciding whether a place as wonderful as Legoland gets to be built in that place, or we have to go back to the drawing board, for example. I was very interested, and I was hoping maybe you could comment on the first graph you put up, which showed a dramatic decrease from 2009 to 2011 in the funding. Now, one might obviously say this obviously relates to the global economic downturn at that time, but it hasn't come back that much according to that graph. Maybe that's not maybe that's just because it's taking some time. I'd like to hear your comment on that, Professor Pak. But it does point to that, and the other graph that you showed points to an interesting phenomenon in East Asian archaeology generally, which has to do with the amount of resources that are being poured into the practice of archaeology in many different places. I know, again, the Chinese example best. And over the last decade, there has been an incredible increase, and I wish we had the sorts of numbers that you were presenting. Perhaps those are available. I haven't seen them for the Chinese context, because not only does that demonstrate the position of archaeology within an understanding of the state and its people, it also is a manifestation of the importance that is attached to archaeology and heritage in terms of presenting the position of a state in the world vis-a-vis other countries. It's not an accident, I think, that in the recent couple of years, as the development of archaeology in China has included increased funding, there's also an increasing attempt to engage with archaeology outside of the Chinese borders, in some cases far outside. There's now an archaeological expedition in Honduras that's sponsored by the Chinese government, which we here at Harvard are facilitating through a program that the Harvard-Yenching Institute is sponsoring next year, in part. And so this engagement in global archaeology is something that is not merely a quest for knowledge, but relates to all the sorts of issues related to the practice of archaeology and its significance. and perhaps it's controversies as well. There are one last point I wanted to make, and maybe this would be a good question to start with proposing to the group, and it relates to a comment that Professor Lahiri made early on, which concerns how institutionalized groups within the discipline of archaeology, or any other discipline for that matter, but in this context within the group institution of archaeology, can resist new discoveries that that require a rethinking of long-held beliefs, that require a rethinking of long-held beliefs that have a particular significance to the way in which people understand themselves. And I'm sure there are examples in each of the contexts that were outlined and described today that relate to that. And so those are my various kind of disorganized comments, and I hope that we can continue our conversation by reflecting on some of them and whatever comments there might be amongst the participants. Thank you.
So let me say that, there's a great deal that I've personally learned from hearing many of the speakers. And especially Professor Park, when he, was showing this slide about the kind of archaeology that is done and the number of projects and so on and so forth, I thought to myself that in India, actually, we still don't have salvage archaeology. So, if you were to just do a comparative study of different Asian contexts, it's true not just for large projects, but even for any kinds of projects in very historic localities. And then, of course, as he went on to deconstruct his graph and show the fact that, academic archaeology is actually not encouraged in, all these contexts, I wondered to myself, what is the situation in Japan, for instance, on this issue, on salvage archaeology? I mean, I would be very interested in hearing about that. And on the question of Japan, I mean, Professor Sasaki, it was amazing, to learn about the impact of God and Child, and the fact that you have all these, the old guard who were members of the Chinese Communist Party, which is also true for a lot of people who worked on the Indian past, from the 1960s onwards in India. But the one difference is that those who were, very closely involved with the communist parties in India, but I think that is not important, who were left-leaning, became very important in the political establishment. So, there was a larger system of patronage which they were able to hand out thanks to their position, within that establishment. And I think that has created, so it's not just a question of holding on to the ideas of Child, but it's a question of the, about the impact of those ideas because of the political clout that you wield. And I must say that neither left-leaning liberals nor, those scholars who are inclined towards the right-leaning BJP have ever made a fuss, and this links up with what you said, about state control over textbooks. It's just taken as a given.
Respond first, or should I go first?
Go ahead.
Well, while Ken is preparing his answers, I may comment on the situations in Korea. We have a very strict laws concerning the research and preservation of archaeological sites. It is a complete control of the government. no one is allowed to excavate any site without a permit from the government. So you have to have a permit from the government. And the Cultural Heritage Administration has its advisory committee, which gives and doesn't give permissions to any kind of archaeological research. And the recent explosion of salvage archaeology was based on a new stipulation in the preservation law, which mandated the archaeological survey or excavation in an area over 30,000 square meters. So that it became the initial point of the growth of the CLM archaeology. And then since it's all controlled, it's all related, this salvage archaeology is related to the construction projects. It really depends on the economic situations, conditions of the time. So in 2009, that was the peak, and then the global economic crisis and also some bad situations in Korean economy led to sudden decline in the amount of work in salvage archaeology. In recent years, since there are so many these cultural heritage institutions, there have been some underbidding for these salvage archaeological works. Some institutions need to survive, so they bid to this archaeological work with a very small amount of money or funding. So the quality of the salvage archaeological work in some cases declined substantially. And that's also another problem appeared in recent years. Another thing I may want to add, my comment, is the lack of theoretical discussion in Korean archaeology or archaeology in East Asia in general. It's always for archaeologists to present data as how long the site is and then what the relations with the neighboring areas and so on. But there is a very lack of theoretical discussion, mainly because of the historical nature of the archaeology. Archaeology is very closely related to history, and all the explanations are given probably historical records and so on. So there is no need to discuss any other ways, but some stories or narratives mentioned in historical records. For the earlier period of Paleolithic and Neolithic archaeology, there are some discussions of the for the interpretation of archaeological data. There are a very limited number of Western scholars working on Korean archaeological data. There are some archaeologists who were educated in the Western institutions, so there is no such dimension of internal versus foreign conflict of interpretation in Korean archaeology, for the time being, at least.
Okay, then I'll add some points on the issues of salvage archaeology and the practice of archaeology and archaeological theory in Japan. Japan is a very small country with very, very high population density, and the density of archaeological site is also high. So I didn't bring exact figure, but the number of archaeological excavations conducted in Japan is close to 10,000, something like 9,000. And the amount of money we spend for archaeological excavation is the highest in the world. And 99% of the archaeological projects in Japan are salvage rescue excavations. And these are carried out by sometimes local governments directly, but oftentimes foundations established by local governments, but run run at the expense of developers. That is to say, in Japan, under the Japanese law of the protection of cultural heritages, developers and landowners have to pay for excavations. So it is possible for local governments to just establish independent units dedicated solely for archaeological excavations, and money comes from developers. And this pays for not only all the expenses in the field and all the expenses for laboratory works, like sometimes one archaeological project result, like 6 months of archaeological project excavation of one settlement site results in the discoveries of like 4 tons of pottery shells. And then it takes 3 years to sort them out. And these are all paid for by developers and landowners. And for that reason, because every year, not 3,000, but far more than 1,000 site reports are published in Japan every year. And that's the reason why it gives strong impression to archaeologists outside Japan that archaeologists in Japan, Japanese archaeologists aren't interested in theory, but too busy with analysis of artifacts. That is, to a large extent, true. But maybe because I'm trained in the United States, all of my friends are highly theoretical. So we do have good theoretical discussions. The only thing is that I guess I should publish papers in English on, for example, theoretical aspects of social evolution in Japan. And I guess good consequence of Japanese strong dependence on Marxist perspective is that since the 1990s, archaeologists and historians in Japan have been making conscious effort to overcome Marxist perspectives. So that really keeps us very, it keeps really our theoretical discussion very active because of, I guess, in the past, too much dependence on Marxist theories.
Well, could you say a little bit about Cambodia in this regard?
Related to salvage archaeology in Cambodia, it happens mostly within Angkor region, because Angkor region is a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we have a committee of a dozen of international projects working in that area. So the requirements to build anything within the protected zone, the salvage archaeologies need to be conducted. Currently, the largest project is the airport, because the airport to Angkor was built in 1920s. They bulldozed a few temples back then, but they were small, so they didn't care, because Angkor was huge. The smaller one, that's not important. But that's the largest extent. The other smaller projects has to do with irrigation project within Angkor, the tourist accommodation structures, restaurants. But again, I think all of these has to do with different background in conducting archaeology. Not every archaeology conducted have the same perspective as American anthropological archaeology. So different questions being asked. Most archaeology in Cambodia has been conducted related to conservation effort. A lot of time artifacts are not screened. Most ceramics were thrown away because all people want was to get into the underground features, the foundations of the temple, dismantle them, put them back, and rebuild. So a lot of the archaeological effort lacks the political economy aspect. But the relationship between archaeology as a practice, archaeological sites, and construction of a nation for Cambodia, it's very strong. I think Cambodia is one of a few, if not two nations that has an archaeological site on the flag. Like India has Ashokan pillar, right? So Cambodia has Angkor Wat on the flag. But it has to do with the fact that by the 1900 or early 1900, mid 1800, Cambodia was conquered by the neighbors. So Thailand took a big chunk of the land. Vietnam took another chunk. And one of the king had sent a letter to France, to one of the French emperor, asking for support. I'm trying to balance this because a lot of scholarship lately has been pointing fingers to the French as the ultimate initiator or constructor of the Cambodian nationalism. But the issues here is that by the 1800s, Cambodia as a state was really weak. So to get help, they need to present something. So present to the French, or before the French, either Vietnam or Thailand, as a chunk of land, as a gift or a payment to their help, military help. But when the French came over and colonized Cambodia, the economy was really bad. So it was a bad investment. But to tell the French in France that that's the right thing to do. If you look at the early text from the end of the 1800s, some history of Cambodia features something like, well, Cambodians were aliens like us. So the idea of aliens devolved into barbarians. The French was there to help these people, and we can't help them by restoring their past to these temples, especially Angkor. A lot of efforts, a lot of money has been channeled into the conservation of Angkor. But most scholarship ignored the fact that part of those money came from the Cambodian government. So it looked like the French did everything, but the Cambodian did nothing. It's a dual process. But when the French came in, the idea of archaeology was pretty much epigraphy. Lots of inscriptions. So the state formation that I talked about had to do with Indianizations because they have a lot of Sanskrit inscriptions. And when they based mostly on Sanskrit inscriptions, there's an image of an Indian political model being applied. And the Marxist part only came after the 1960s. So the Marxist historians looked at the Khmer inscriptions. It's similar version, but the Khmer inscriptions, they list every part of donations to the temple, the property of the temples, the extent of the temples, who were donated to the temples, what were donated, what kind of animal were donated. So Marxist historians contribute to the study of political economies, whereas Sanskritists contribute to the construction of dynastic successions. I think that's an interesting interactions, because Sanskritists often call themselves Indianist, and they have a great sentiment against theoretical approach. So they terms anthropological approach to state formations, try to keep them state as sociological, and they said it's not applicable to Cambodian history. Hence, the study of Cambodian history and archaeology in that aspect. The political economy has been lacking. What else I want to say? Anyway, so we don't actually have salvage archaeology. My colleagues and I have been trying to push that through, but not very successful, because the idea now is developing the countries, and nothing can stop it. Road constructions, settlement expansions, often conducted without research at all.
I want to, I'm sure everybody at the table has a lot more to say. I do want to open up so that we have a chance to have some questions asked. If anyone has a question now, please raise your hand. We can continue our conversation, but we're eventually going to want to move to the receptions, so it's not, make sure we just talk about it. So are there any questions that, yeah?
To what degree in any of these countries do non-governmental organizations like sort of archaeological NGOs or heritage entities sort of influence this process? We're really curious, especially perhaps in the case of India and Cambodia in particular, but for all the countries.
Would you like to?
Yeah, just one comment on that. I'm aware of at least one NGO that is offering cultural resource management services, but at the moment I don't think anybody's actually opting for it because it's not enforced. And I do know one case where there was a private company that wanted to build a check dam in central India, Maharashtra, and the local administration actually requested them to take the services of the government, the Archaeological Survey of India, to actually survey the land first before development and construction. I mean, so it's happening at small scales, maybe, but at a very minimal level. And there's not enough NGOs that offer these services, and plus the lack of enforcement.
There's actually one big NGO which works in India in different parts, and that is INTAC. INTAC actually, has branches in the different cities, and they do work on conservation, but they don't actually do field work. They don't do excavation work. And I think the unfortunate thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that, unlike if you were to compare, let's say, endangered contexts, and if you look at the environment, that there's a very large body of people outside government who have made themselves very visible and very influential in India in attempting to, stop certain kinds of activities. Frequently, it doesn't work, but at least this is a subject of discussion and thinking in the public domain. As far as archaeology in India is concerned, it's really very much the defenseless past, and you don't have an adequate, NGO movement. And I've often felt that, what should archaeologists do in this situation? Actually, at the end of it, you have to make a choice, because if you want to be an activist and to, encourage a non-governmental organization movement, then you have to do that. Then you can't, be an academic. It's just difficult to be both.
Well, in case of Korea, there are roughly 3 groups of organizations which would affect the development or conservation of archaeological sites. One is nationwide or regional level NGOs who are for the preservation of any historical sites. And then scholarly organizations, I mentioned there are more than a dozen or so scholarly organizations in archaeology, which will sometimes announce statements for the preservation of archaeological site. And the third part is this advisory committee of cultural heritage administration, which is actually in charge of the making final decision. But the committee members are all basically specialists in academia. Most of them are. So they are most often in favor of the preservation, but because of the interests and then lobby of these all development companies, sometimes we lose.
I'll add one thing here. I'm not sure I need this, but just in case. In China, actually, pretty much every role that was just described in Korea is a GO. It's a governmental organization, with the exception of that there are some just recently started CRM-like firms that are doing some support research for pay within China. And that's not exactly the sort of organization you're referring to. However, the only ones that I know about that are truly NGOs related that are engaged in archaeological activities, broadly construed, are the couple of organizations that are focused on the repatriation of artifacts that are in foreign museums to China in one fashion or another, and these are often very nationalist, politicized efforts to identify objects that may be in museums that could be pressured to return them to China for one reason or another. So that's an example of a type of NGO that is doing vaguely archaeological work, but I think in a very different way. I don't know if there are other examples that you know.
Yeah, for Cambodia, it's a mix because, like I was talking about earlier for the Angkor regions, most of the project conducted in Angkor run by international organizations, but that's an issue in themselves because since each project represents each country, so those projects tend to have their own nationalism embedded within the project too. In Angkor, there were a dozen of such projects working mostly in restorations. So we have a French NGO, German conservation project, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Americans, all have different agenda. But how those agenda influence the decisions of the archaeological research differ greatly from one project to the other. Because since most of them focus on restoration, archaeology as a secondary aspect. But some of those NGOs actually have done a great job because they push archaeologists, Cambodian archaeologists working for the government to pursue a different route. For example, the methodology to excavate the site, some of them became much careful than they used to. Outside of Angkor, we have different projects associated with different universities. So we have from University of Hawaii, University of Northern Illinois. We have so a university from Japan and Germany and France. Those tend to be very good because those projects were run by archaeologists. So they actually drive the archaeological research outside Angkor to a different degree than those conducted in Angkor itself.
Well, I have a brief question to Mr. Parth, who asked this. Recently, I read a book, written by, Yuval Harari, which is the, bestseller of the last year, the *Sapiens*, and then he claimed that the humankind was not originated from East Africa, and the humankind route, that they migrate, should be also, rectified. He's saying that there may be is multiple origin, not the originally from East, like Ethiopia or Kenya area. So what do you think of this theory? And I think you briefly mentioned about this, in your presentation. And what is your opinion about this? And also I have another question to Mr. Sasaki. And in terms of controversy in Japan, there are 9 mausolea, has been excavated yet. And as I understand, the Japanese imperial, family are actually originated from Puyo family in northern China, which are also basis for the Koguryo and Baekje royal family. And at the same time, they are the same clan of this Puyo family. And then what do you think about this theory, and what is your opinion? Because I heard you are majoring in nation building at the time. So I have these 2 questions. Thank you.
Just to answer your question, it's not, multiple origins is not impossible. But what we go with is evidence at hand. And the current evidence we have right now for modern humans is in East Africa, in Ethiopia, roughly 200,000 years old. Now, if we find similar age fossils elsewhere, then we either have to think about parallel evolution, or we have to think of another point of origin which we haven't discovered yet. And we're getting that all the time in all species, technologies. So it's possible, but at the moment we don't have the evidence. Yeah.
So you're maintaining the single origin?
At the moment, yes, based on the currently available evidence. Yeah.
To my embarrassment, I didn't know that theory. During the Kofun period, Japan received many advanced technologies and ideas from the Korean Peninsula, and also not only the highest ranking chief in Japan, that is to say, probably ancestor of the Imperial Court of Japan, and also many local elites invited specialists from the Korean Peninsula, and there is and also these Korean people from the Korean Peninsula were settled in Japan, probably married locally in Japan, and of course the Imperial Family was one of them. And historically, it is, it's a solid fact that Emperor Kammu, who reigned from the 780s until 780s until the beginning of the 9th century, who really moved the capital to Kyoto. His empress, the first official wife, the official wife, came from Korea. So so from our point of view, it is taken for granted that the many Korean people came to Japan throughout the Kofun period and early historic period and married locally in Japan. So there is no dispute. And related to this, there was, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there was a newspaper article in New York Times that excavation, an archaeological excavation of a large mounded tomb was stopped because the national government feared that it might disclose Korean origins of the Imperial Family. First of all, it's not fact at all. I wonder why New York Times published such an erroneous news at all. And the thing is that we cannot excavate imperial mausolea just because the government defines it. They are sacred and private, rather than archaeological sites are our people's common heritages, but imperial mausolea are excluded from this category. And this has nothing to do with, for example, like a Korean heritage or anything like that. Just somehow, under the law right now, they are considered as the private properties of the Imperial Family.
We're unfortunately going to have to take just one more question, I think, because of some pressing issues with a couple of our participants. So, yeah.
I'm not an archaeologist, although I'm just trying to become one. I was sort of trained as a historian, and I went in England, and I went to China, and my experience was really spending a lot of time in the countryside, where I realized that, people who worked in cultural preservation were often interested in very old artifacts, but where I was researching, this was central outway, and I've also been in other parts of China and sort of just hung around. There's so much which is a century old, or 5 centuries old, or 1,000 years old, even, which is still there, and there's a great tension when you go there and think about what can be done with this. When I come back here, I think, is it archaeological or is it historical archaeological? And the tension there is between like development, which came up in everyone's comments, I think, and what, on the other hand, the government wants to do, and what the people there want to do, and what a researcher might feel he or she could do. And this extends even to a place like Shanghai, which is only 100 years old, but still, you could argue that its buildings are historically and archaeologically significant, and people who are foreigners living in Shanghai actually really push that forward a lot, but that Shanghai government and many Shanghainese just say, no, we don't care, like, it's, we don't want this, we want a modern setting and everything. My question is really just like an observation, or is kind of just directed to anybody who has noticed this, or thinks about this, or worried about this, is how far do you push this forward into what counts as archaeological in your mind? What is historical archaeology? Do you have dialogue with people doing historical archaeology? I mean, I'd love to know about Sichuan or anywhere in Japan, but do these comments resonate? Or do you welcome doing this?
Well, as far as Korea is concerned, there is no distinction between archaeological and historical monuments or sites. And I guess in each of the Asian countries has different laws, a system of laws governing the preservation of sites, historical / archaeological sites. And so the preservation really depends on whether it is being designated for preservation, whether it's part of the preservation system. If it is part of either locally or centrally preserved site, it has a very strong legal foundation that it could be preserved even under the threat of the development. But in our case, if it's not, the most often development prevails.
In Japan, okay, my guess is that the distinction between historical and archaeological is not the date, when, but whether the superstructure still exists or not. That is to say, in Japan, we have numerous Buddhist temple structures that has been standing since the late 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. And they are, I guess, historical. But the thing is, the underground portion is archaeological. And it's not a matter of date. And in Japan, we when there is enough budget, we do carefully excavate archaeological sites of the late 19th and 20th centuries. And especially in recent years in Japan, archaeological excavations of sites related to the Second World War II, the Second World War have become very, very important because most of the written records do not exist.
Yeah, I also may add that until probably 1990s or so. More recent sites of Koryo or Joseon Dynasty periods were not really excavated. They were most often disregarded. But with the development of salvage archaeology, even those sites belonging to early 20th century are being excavated and reported. So there is a certain change in the attitude toward what constitute as archaeological site or historical site.
I hope very much we can continue this conversation in the reception that is upstairs, I believe, just now. But I wanted us all to thank our workshop participants one more time.